Is not this Joseph's son? That was the question that was asked by the people after Jesus had read and spoken briefly in the synagogue. Nazareth was the town in which he had been brought up. Nazareth was the town where he had been known as a boy. And it's not a simple thing to preach to such folk. Usually they remember nearly everything but that which is spiritual in its connotation. I remember when I was a student in seminary, I went back one Sunday to preach in my old home country church in Canada. After the sermon, I was reminded of a good many things that I had hoped they had forgotten. There was the time, for instance, when as a boy in the presence of the neighbors, I was milking a cow and she spilled the entire bucket of milk all over me. And I recall very well that I did not behave as a prophet nor the son of a prophet. So it was that one after another of those people came to the front of the sanctuary following the service, reminding me of boyhood accidents, reminding me of boyhood pranks, and leaving me humbly recognizing how very difficult it is to have any honor in one's own country. There I was attempting to preach the gospel, and they were sitting down in the pews, remembering things that a boy had done, a boy whom I'm afraid got into at least his share of mischief. I imagine all of us can feel our hearts beat with that kind of experience. At least to some degree, we have had it happen to us, and we understand the better the difficulty that Jesus was having that day in Nazareth. This was the place in which he had been brought up, and you can hear them asking, what right has this boy, this carpenter's son, this son of Joseph, to get up in the synagogue and talk as though he were a great prophet? In the Gospel of John, we are told that even his brothers didn't accept the fact that there was anything very unusual about him. So far as they were concerned, he was just another brother. He was just another carpenter, a boy with whom they had played, a good fellow, yes, but so far as having any unusual wisdom was concerned, so far as having anything more of God in him than anyone else, well, they knew better. And so we find the people in the 4th chapter of Luke asking this question, is not this Joseph's son? There's a note of hostility in it. There's a note of indignation in it. The boy that they had watched grow up in Nazareth, can this possibly be he? And who does he think he is? There is an old maxim that familiarity breeds contempt. Many of us might consider that this is an extreme statement of the matter, but at least there's a suggestion of it running through all of life, isn't there? There is a something about familiarity that seems to breed contempt. In the much-quoted Screwtape Letters, there is one place where the devil tells his nephew on earth that if he wants to keep a certain person from becoming a Christian, he should keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. Aggravate, he said, that most useful human characteristic, the horror and the neglect of the obvious. A most useful human characteristic, the horror and the neglect of the obvious. Well, it is something of a human characteristic. We have a tendency to look past the obvious as being something that is too well known to us for us to bother with it. We have a tendency to neglect the familiar. Probably all of us would do well to take another look at that matter. In the first place, let us remind ourselves of the folly of not taking a little closer look at some of the things that we're accustomed to say and some of the things that we are accustomed to do, some of the things that we're accustomed to work with every day. How often when one gets into trouble, the comment is made, he ought to have known better. And isn't it startling as one looks back over the mistakes that he has made in life, the trouble he has gotten into, how frequently this is the most appropriate comment that could be made. He ought to have known better. What's really being said is that he has tripped on a very familiar path. Something that he has seen every day, something with which he is well acquainted, and yet somehow or other he was looking without seeing. I heard a sermon preached one time by a very elderly preacher on that 14th chapter of Matthew, where we're told of Jesus walking on the sea. You remember that Peter tried to go to him, and he wasn't very successful, and he began to sink, and he cried, "Lord, save me." Simon Peter was a fisherman. He had been brought up around that sea. He probably knew every foot of it. And this elderly minister made the statement that Peter, like so many would-be Christians since, often had his greatest difficulty in familiar waters. Now think on that. Often we have our greatest difficulty in familiar water. We can go through the most dangerous situations in strange places. And if some misfortune befall us in a place that we should have known better. Here was a man that spent 20 years washing the windows of skyscrapers. And he broke his leg helping his wife to hang a curtain. That should keep some men out of some household chores this week. But we've trouble with the familiar waters. Is there anything, for instance, with which we have more trouble than with ourselves? We spend more time with ourselves. We are supposed to know ourselves better than any other person or any other thing in the world. Yet what terrible trouble we have with us. Habits that we never thought that we would ever get into. Habits that we were sure were habits that might get hold of other people, but they would never touch us. In some strange way they do. Thoughts that we were sure were completely outside our pale. Things with which our minds would never waste time have found their way into our thinking. Depressions that we believe to be contrary to our nature often have taken over for much longer periods than we care to confess. How often it is that we see some person who apparently is always cheerful and seems to be completely on top of life, and when he comes to you for counsel, you find that this, for the most part, was a mask. That he was going through problems day after day, and he just didn't want neighbors to know about it. There are times when the things that we know we ought to do become almost impossible for us to do. And when we do wrong, We find ourselves making excuses for ourselves, as we noted last Sunday. We say, I wasn't myself when I did that. We say we didn't mean to do it. Or we say that someone else influenced us. And this being that we thought we knew so well frequently turns out to be quite a stranger, a startling stranger. Van Wyck's book says that Jack London was destroyed by egotism. But the thirst for power destroyed the artist that was in him, and he wondered why he was so unhappy and why with others he was so very unpopular. Well, there's something of Jack London in some form or other that threatens everyone. But to see him, we may have to take a little closer look at this being that we thought we knew so well. So it is with the home. Familiar place, isn't it? We could sit down and in a moment we could draw the floor diagram of the home, and we know every nook and cranny of it. And yet the danger that lurks there. Oh, I'm not thinking so much in terms of the statistics of more accidents happening in bathtubs than there are in highways. I'm thinking of something much more serious than that. The kind of thing that happens with the children that live there. A recent survey indicates that a very large percentage of juvenile delinquents show signs of going wrong when they're under 10 years of age. It makes that first 10 years pretty important. When parents are unwilling or unable to guide their children in formative years, when certain tendencies are not checked and corrected, youngsters tend to join groups. They tend to latch on to gangs. They tend to congregate on street corners. They tend to cultivate bad habits. And the job that ought to have been done in the home is turned over to the church and to other institutions in the community. When my father and mother forsake me, the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts will take me up. Many parents who thought that their home was a good place, that they've done a fairly good job with it, have suddenly found tragedy in very familiar waters. We need to remind ourselves that every now and then we should take just a close look at the things we do, the things we say, the purposes to which we dedicate ourselves every day. But more important than that, I think, is that the neglect of the familiar can shut us off from some great possible values that are there. Values and virtues that we fail to see because we are so accustomed to them, just as these people failed to see anything other than the Son of Joseph in Jesus Christ. Recall that John Greenleaf Whittier was brought up in a farmhouse. He was very happy there, as is indicated in the work that he wrote called Snowbound. But he never thought that a great poet was going to come out of that place. He didn't feel that that was the kind of spot from which poets could ever come. Poets came from great cities. Poets came from great cultural centers. Poets came from areas where The intellect and the spirit could be cultivated better than they ever could in his area. And then one night a peddler came to the door, and he was invited to stay all night. And after dinner, he read some of the songs of Robert Burns. And Whittier sat spellbound. He borrowed a copy from his school teacher, and in it he made a great discovery. I found, he says, that the things out of which poems come were not as I had always imagined, somewhere far off in a world of life lying outside our own sky. They were right here about my feet and among the people that I knew. Wasn't he right? If we but think of them, aren't the things that lead to the greatest happiness those that are not off in any far-off land at all? Such things as health, friendship, sunshine, the love that we feel at home. Professor Lecky told of a man who had done a monumental piece of writing. When he was finished, congratulations were sent to him from all corners of the earth. But he said that none of those congratulations gave him nearly the thrill that he got when he heard the patter of the feet of his neighbor's children coming up the walk. Children that for years he had worked trying to get them to love him. Now they had responded with it so warmly. The British Weekly is quite a paper, and occasionally it comes through with warm articles. A few weeks ago, it told about a family that had a rather startling experience in this area. A family that got into the habit of writing down every day the things that had given them most joy. This all started by the work of the youngest member of the family, a little girl. Her mother caught her writing one day, and she would write furiously with her little hand, and then she would think for a moment, and then she would bite her pencil, and then she would rub out a word, and she would write in something else. And finally, when the mother felt that it might be appropriate for her to speak and ask what was happening, she asked the little girl if she might see. And the child held up the sheet of paper for her. The heading of it was, "My 12 loveliest things, people not counted." Not good. My 12 loveliest things, people not counted. Listen to them. The cold of ice cream, the scrunch of dry leaves as you walk through them, or mud of a road oozing up through your toes. The feel of clean clothes. You can tell she was a little girl and not a little boy, can't you? Water running into the bath. Further evidence. Cool wind on a hot day. This one's lovely. Climbing up and looking back. Doesn't it catch the imagination? A hot water bottle in bed on a cold night. Honey in your mouth. The smell of a drugstore. Babies smiling. The feeling inside you when you sing. Baby kittens. My 12 loveliest things. People not counted. Every one of them extremely ordinary, but this child had seen them, this child had experienced them, this child knew them. And she gloried in the familiar. I wonder how many good things surround us every day and we fail to appreciate them simply because we are so familiar with them. Some of the couples, for instance, that are having difficulty making a go of it. Often it's purely and simply because they've come to the place where they're taking each other for granted. They're such familiar sights that they just don't really notice anymore. The unusual that they once saw in each other has become the usual, and it shouldn't be. And the problem doesn't stop with the home. Many people do we see every day whose virtues we fail to appreciate just because we do see them so often. Start clicking them off in your mind. The elevator man at work, the office building doorkeeper, the janitor, the sexton, the secretaries in the office, the next door neighbor. How long since we've really noticed them? Not just a casual hello. And then suddenly something happens and sets them apart, and we can't believe it. We've been living beside them for so long, and we fail to realize what they are. And so these people of Nazareth looked on Jesus, and they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" So it's essential, you see, that we prod our minds awake to the gifts of God that are scattered everywhere. Spring's going to come someday, and we'll have an opportunity to see it a little better. The poet said, "Christians awake, the winter's gone, the snows depart, the dead sleep on. And though you may not long survive, get out of bed and look alive." I'm glad some people are hearing that over the radio this morning. I imagine that was the approach that Jesus himself took to life. Can't you almost hear him getting up in the morning and saying, "I wonder what God's going to say to me through his creations today?" So he saw a tree twisted in among the rocks, having great difficulty growing, and he saw there a likeness to men and their problems, but he also saw trees that were planted in the good earth, and they flourished, and he recognized that the soul of man is like that. It feeds upon the truth. He saw it as clearly as if it were written by the finger of God. He looked at a fruit tree that failed to produce, and he knew that some men were like that, and they're not pleasing in the sight of God, and he saw people who were worried. And he remembered something else that he saw about him, and so he said, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow, they toil not, neither do they spin. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these." It's not work, you see, it's trouble. It's care that kills people. And written in the beauty of the lily is the truth that God takes care of that which is completely surrendered to him. Brother Lawrence was just a raw lout of a soldier, footsore, limping along the road. And he saw a tree bursting into leaf. And all at once his heart stood still, he said. And he thought, if God can bring that wonder of fresh life out of a thing so dear and so dead, what could he not do with my soul? And there on the dusty road, it all began. God pierces the day with these things of wonder. Sometimes it's a rose bush. Sometimes it's the ripple of a brook that soothes and satisfies. Sometimes it's just a mother hen with her chickens. But they light up life's drabness, and they soften its harshness, and they sweeten its sourness. Something tragic about a people that had lived so close to him, in whom there was more of God than ever was in any human being before or since. And they saw nothing but Joseph's son. Why didn't they see? I suppose they'd say they were all so busy making a living they never really had time to think about it. That's the reason we usually give. If your nose is close to the grindstone rough and you keep it down there long enough, you will soon forget there are such things as a brook that babbles and a bird that sings. Three things your whole wide world will compose: yourself, your stone, and your worn-out nose. And yet we keep doing it. And the spiritual in life becomes starved. I like the way one little fellow expressed it. He'd been to Sunday school. And the Sunday school teacher was telling him about all the wonderful things in nature and how the best in life is just God shining through life. And if we look closely enough, we'll see him in the blossom, and we'll see him in the laughter of children, and we'll see him in the sunlight trying to make its way through the branches of a tree. And when he went home on this beautiful day, he was describing to his father what had happened that afternoon. And the little fellow said, we were all going down the street when suddenly along comes God. Look for him, will you? He's there. The people of Nazareth missed him. And so they saw only Joseph's son. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you peace.